Everybody stop talking. That was great. Welcome to the first event in our fall lecture series. It's great to see so many people here. This is like wonderful. We've been working on it all summer. And I'd like to start by introducing the people who have been working the hardest, our lecture committee. Annalie Bennett, Christopher Flocka, and Jonathan Browning. You guys want to stand up and kind of say hello. They're right here, these three guys here. Okay, and there were about 18 other people who have been helping putting things together, publicity, fundraising, and stuff. And I'd like to thank them. It's really made our job a lot easier, and the job's going to go on for the next, till the end of the semester. And you're all welcome back, of course. It's the tradition at SCI-Arc for the second-year graduate students to put together this series. And it's also the tradition for the undergraduates to put together the series in the fall. Both of these events are done under the auspices of the student government and are funded through the students. Funds are given by the student government each semester for that. And some funds also come from some very generous donors. The purpose of the lecture series is kind of to let students enthusiastically chase down their curiosities about ideas and about people. This semester, what we're dealing with is the architectural imagination, and that's kind of an intuitive title. What we're dealing with is the relationship between the physiological imagination and the way somebody develops of working with that imagination, which, if you kind of imagine maybe like a computer, hardware and software and how they work together, that's kind of what we're thinking about. And over the next semester, it's kind of up to everybody who comes to see this to figure out how it's going to be put together. We're not sure. And all 8 speakers that are going to be here have been chosen specifically because they can either speak about the subject or they're great examples of some part of it. So it should be an interesting study. I'd like to introduce now the director of our school, Michael Rotondi, who has a few things to say.
Good evening. Welcome to the first lecture of the fall series, but also the first lecture that's taking place in the rejuvenated facilities we have here. For those of you that have been coming here over the years, you will remember the pipe structure, the scaffolding system that we used to call it. And over the last few years have sort of remained as a kind of residue of the school's beginnings. And it was, I think, essential that as we explore the very nature of architectural education, that we physically alter the school, which was a part of I think one of the founding premises of the school, that not only do ideas change, but so do the facilities. It's becoming a little bit more permanent looking, I think, as time goes on. The first thing I wanted to say is to acknowledge how all of this work got done. It was organized and ramrodded, literally, by one of our young faculty. That he always gets embarrassed whenever he's acknowledged for anything. But I think that instead of acknowledging, if he doesn't want to be acknowledged, I suppose the type of person that he is should be acknowledged, because I think that it's, as was recently stated, he seems to exemplify the sort of ideal student and ideal faculty that a school like this can have, which is fundamentally, I think, has to do with whenever anything gets done, it's a result of someone's willpower. And all of the work that you see here, which seems to be a simple undertaking, occurred over a three-week period. But also with a bit of levity. We have a trophy of sorts for Gary in appreciation from all of the people that are here, the students, the staff, and the faculty. Oh, actually, I should give him the serious thing first. This is a very useful gift for Gary. I think it has something to do with the difficulty of trying to get in touch with him. He has a peculiar phone answering machine that sometimes works and sometimes doesn't. So the staff decided that this would be the occasion to give him a new one that works all of the time. And then this little memento here was actually what I was in the original graduating class here, and this is what we were given in lieu of diplomas 15 years ago. And they were caricatures done by Bill Simonian. So Gary can hang this next to the diploma that he got from here when he graduated. So in appreciation for all of Gary's efforts, I think he deserves a round of applause. Okay. Friday, I was on a panel with some artists back in the Midwest, and the topic of discussion was one that's still a bit curious, but I think an important one to discuss, which is what the relationship, it basically has to do with the relationship of architecture to art and vice versa. The title of the symposium was Art and Sculpture and Architecture, Architecture and Sculpture. Throughout the discussion, there was various points of view about what the relationship was. It struck me that architecture has been in a very difficult predicament for quite a few years. It didn't have a pulse. It lacked a heartbeat. And I think that within the last perhaps 10 years, a pulse has begun to beat once again. And in thinking about what was probably instrumental in allowing architecture to begin to regenerate itself, it seems that it had to do with architects becoming sort of less exclusive about what their source material was. And they began to look, I think, at the ideas that were being produced in the art world. And they were looking very specifically at a variety of artists that I think were doing work that was not only critically important, but I think important to the whole idea of an individual pursuing ideas in a way that could only be manifested by trusting one's instincts. It also had to do with architecture once again realizing that it was important that it become an investigatory process, that it was one where ideas were pursued, and then when you caught them, you didn't leave them alone, that you looked at them from all angles. You turned them upside down, you turned them inside out, and then you built things, you made things that would allow you to explore the ideas in a manifested state. I believe there's some artists that have been doing that in a way that has been, I think, quite exemplary. The speaker tonight, if any of you saw the retrospective at the County Museum, some of you may have looked at them and saw just mere paintings on the wall, but when you really looked at the body of work, you could understand that the interest was much more fundamental than just the interest that one might have if one only deals with the craft of painting or even the craft of architecture. It had to do, I think, with an interest in questioning our very existence and how we perceive the world around us and what our relationship is to that world. It had to do with a very fundamental exploration of the concept of exchange, the exchange that occurs between people and objects. And I think that the shifting around, it's not even shifting around, the movement from one media to another, which will be shown tonight by virtue of a movie, it seems to be inevitable when you start to understand the nature of exploration, how one thing ultimately becomes the impetus for the next thing. And I think that David Hockney's work has exemplified that from the very beginning. I think having him here is also a part of an interest that we have here at SCI-Arc, as expressed by the faculty and I think by the students, of not only talking about the value of artists, but bringing them into our midst and having them talk about ideas in a way that we can only imagine them, and hopefully it'll help sort of shake us off center. The formal introduction for David will be done by Robert Mangurian, who is the director of the graduate program here. Robert? One other person that I'd like to introduce, which I think she's key to a variety of things here in the city, but I think to the whole notion of bringing artists into the school and having them work in a variety of ways, is Alysse Greenstein. She's organized this semester a studio made up of 4 artists that are teaching a design studio for architects, and it's based on the assumption that there's going to be reciprocity between the architects and the artists.
Elyse is a good friend of David, has known him for many years, and I'm going to shorten this by letting her introduce David.
Thank you. I'm very pleased to be asked to introduce David. He wears a lot of hats. He's a painter, as we all know, and a sculptor. I can attest to the fact that he's a great architectural collaborator and client. He makes wonderful prints using media that we never even thought about. He showed us some laser prints tonight that he's been doing. And tonight the hat he wears is that of teacher. He's taught us all how to see and how to perceive what we see. So it's my pleasure to introduce David Hockney.
I'll just introduce the film now. I'm now just going to introduce this movie that we'll show, and then I'll talk afterwards or answer questions. The movie was made by myself and Philip Haas. Well, I told him to come. He's in LA, but I don't know whether he's here. He came to me and said he had some money from, I think it was the Getty Trust, to make 10-minute films about art and art history. And was I interested? Did I have any ideas? And I met him in London at Gilbert and George's one day. He'd made a movie about them. And I went for tea, and I met him, and then he kept nattering me. Anyway, when I did Hominar, and eventually I came up with an idea. I said I'd been looking into, I'd got very interested in Oriental art, Chinese in particular, through actually, oddly enough, through photography, through all the photography I was doing. It took me, made me look at Chinese painting, and I saw it's very hard to see, really, because the scrolls really are rarely exhibited or can't be exhibited because the nature of them is that you move them yourself and look at them. But I then made a suggestion about showing these 2 scrolls and doing the film, but I pointed out it couldn't possibly be 10 minutes long. And he said, well, I don't know, they had to be 10 minutes. I said, well, they're only thinking in terms of Western art then, if they're asking for a 10-minute film, because The actual scanning shot of only one of the scrolls took 12 minutes. And I said, that's the equivalent of a quick glance in Chinese time. And so I complained to them, and they did keep insisting it should be 10 minutes. I said, well, I don't understand. We made this film for the same price everybody else made their 10-minute films for. And I suppose they spent their money in luscious hotels in Italy. We didn't. We did it here, actually. The scrolls are, one belongs to the Metropolitan Museum, and the other is privately owned. But I first saw it 5 years ago, at the Metropolitan Museum. One Sunday, the curator took me to see it, and it was open on the floor. It's 70 foot long. And I spent 4 hours looking at it on my knees, and it was one of the most thrilling afternoons I'd ever had. I told him I thought it was a marvelous work of art, totally unknown to me, and I'm sure it will be to you. I don't think it's ever been exhibited. It was, the scroll was commissioned by the Emperor of China in 1690, and it probably took about a year to paint. It's then rolled up, and it was kept in the map archive in Peking. It wasn't necessarily thought of as a work of art. Like a lot of art, it was never really made as art. And it was probably there. The emperor probably saw it once. I've probably seen it far more than the emperor ever did. And the scroll turned up in, I was told it was probably looted about the time of the Boxer Rebellion, or when the eunuchs were looting things, and it turned up in, somebody saw it in Madrid in a little shop and bought it, and the present owners got it from a dealer in Copenhagen who found it in Madrid. But I think you like, just as a wonderful work of art, it's very, very beautiful, wonderful drawing in it, and oddly enough, it's a great way to see the scrolls on film, because as we were doing it, I realized film itself is a scroll. You're really putting a scroll onto a scroll, because you can't really put a scroll in a book, because the book has too many edges that goes over on itself, and so it's not really a good way to see them. So maybe film is a good way, and as far as I know, they've never made films on Chinese scrolls, because Philip Haas found a library that told him how many existed, and there seemed to be about 3. He found one of them. He said it was extremely dull. But so we'll show the movie, and I showed it to Elyse a long time ago, and when she said, would I come in, I said, well, you know, maybe architects might be interested in it, because it is about perspective. And I used to think it was photographers who were dominated by perspective, by Western perspective, because they thought it was built into their camera. You had to have a perspective picture. I've since found out it's actually architects who are more dominated by it. Who's that theoretician here? Wrote a book on postmodernism. Charles Jenks tried to tell me in an argument one day that perspective existed in nature, which I thought was weird if somebody believed that. And he also told me when I suggested the misinterpreted cubism and it opens up narrative, another marvelous way for narrative, he said that was too clever by half, that idea. But I wasn't that impressed with his ideas. But anyway, so I'll show them and then I'll if you've got an ashtray, I might have a cigarette here, seeing this is like a stage. I'm one of the last of the smokers here. Oh, no. What should I do now then?
If you have a question, you raise your hand. He'll call on you, you ask, he'll answer. The conventional process. You stand up when you ask the question, speak as clearly as you possibly can.
I must tell you, I'm not quite sure how ideas going against Western perspective can be used architecturally, but they can certainly be used pictorially in very interesting ways. But I suspect they could be used architecturally. I might have a go myself. Well, the Tristan and Isolde, which we did here last year, those where you're using a lot of different perspectives. That I couldn't have done that way without studying the Chinese ideas of space. The theater, after all, is the Italian theater anyway, which opera is deeply about perspective in a way. The moment you have a proscenium and beyond it is an illusion. And I realized you could change it, you could alter it in a way, make different illusions. And it then occurred to me after that if you carried it into, I'd often been asked, for instance, to design Shakespeare plays. And I always said no, I thought they didn't need me. And eventually I realized why. I pointed out that the English theater, the English Renaissance theater, is actually a kind of cubist theater. It's the stage comes out at you. There's no point really where the illusion is defined beyond it. And therefore in Shakespeare, in a sense, you don't really need much scenery. He always describes it in the text, it's in the poetry. And I realized that maybe that's perhaps why it doesn't work on television too good, because television is, you're back at the Italian theater. It's an edge, and then you go into it. And so they haven't found a way around that yet, but maybe we will. Well, once you get interested in perspective and its implications, I mean, it took me a long time to realize. It took me a long time to realize when I was doing that photography that it was really about perspective, and I'd never thought much. I tended to accept it. No art magazine had ever had articles about perspective. It was taken for granted in a way. And then I realized that maybe in a way, the sources of what we call modern art, which I argue has not yet triumphed, so I don't know what postmodernism is actually. I don't know what it means in painting or anything. But because, in a way, the first the first way of looking at an altering perspective actually was in painting. It's now 100 years old. The first ways were looking at Japanese prints, which of course is from Chinese painting. All Japanese art is older in China. I mean, it's all from China. Then they looked at, later, Matisse and Picasso looked at oceanic art, African art. It was always non-European. It was outside of Europe, because a European perspective and so on made you look at the world a certain way and wanted to measure it a certain way. And in a way, even today, art history is still dominated by Europeanists. They cannot, they don't like it actually. In fact, when this film was shown on, we showed it on television in England, and people are very disturbed by when you criticize lines doing that and what it might mean, because they accept it. And there's vast implications in accepting, even political as well. And in a way, I think in, as I say, what we call modern art, I think we've made, to me, I now see it as vast errors. One of them being that there is a difference, there's something called abstraction, and then there's something called representation. There isn't, there can't be. There can only be one. It's all an abstraction or it's all a representation. So what do we mean by it? Photography itself is an abstraction, perspective is an abstraction for depicting space and so on. And it does have, I think it does have amazing effects when we really go into it. And I don't know, I think we're living in a rather exciting time. Vast, very profound changes are happening. And some of them are, I mean, they even affect politics in a way as well. I've illustrated this way, in the sense we're witnessing now the admitted failure of the Marxist experiment. Even the leaders of the Soviet Union are admitting their failure. In fact, they have to do something about it and do it quick, otherwise they'll be broke in 15 years. And it occurred to me, there's a way of looking at it, that is another way. It's rather more fascinating, perhaps, because Marxism always claimed to be scientific. That was partly its appeal to intellectuals, I think. But it's scientific only in terms of 19th century science. In the 19th century, science thought it could know everything. It was just a matter of time, they sorted out a few things. 20th century science is not like that. They know, they can't know everything. In fact, they've come up against the unknowable and deal with it. And in doing that, they've made wonderful, marvelous discoveries. I think in that sense, that's part of it. I can begin to link things. I find it very exciting. I told Elyse to read that book, Chaos. I found that thrilling, really thrilling. I loved the idea on the jacket. I think it was Douglas Hofstadter said what it was about. It's about science, new science from mathematical ideas. But I love the way of putting it. They said, under the facade of order lurked chaos, and under the chaos lurked an eerie kind of order. And the moment I read that, I thought, that sounds true to me. Without paradox, there's no kind of truth. So I gobbled it up and found it absolutely fascinating. And you can relate it to a lot of things, as I say, the depiction of space, politics, all kinds of things. I also pointed out to Elyse in the book, there's a marvelous chapter on fractal geometry that I was drawn to. The moment I read about it, I was drawn to the ideas. And there's a description in the book of why he thought the Paris Opera was a much more better building than the Seagram building. I loved his description of why. It was to do with scale, that one has only one scale, one has all scale. But the ideas of fractal geometry seemed to me to offer something I pointed out to architects that seemed to me they were crying out for, was ornament. We don't know how to make fresh, new ornament, which it seems to me is what buildings could do with. And in a way, ornament has to come from nature, like anything, but fractal geometry offers a new way of looking at it, so it offers new things, and I thought that was incredibly exciting if people can respond to it, or the imaginative mind will respond to it. So I link all the things that are happening. I think there's as I say, it's already begun. There's vast revolutions have begun that are very powerful. They go way beyond politics, I think so. And I point out even in politics, for instance, when Mr. Gorbachev was making a speech, I pointed out, because I've been playing with a Xerox machine. You can't buy a Xerox machine in the Soviet Union, in Eastern Europe. Now, the reason is because if you could, you'd have a free press. Well, that means they can't have a society without Xerox machines, fax machines, and so on. They will go broke in 10 years, 15 years. But it means for them to introduce them, it's a political decision. So it's very big, but they're going to have to, actually. And I think that's terrific. I like that idea. I'm an anarchist at heart, so I've never quite never totally fallen for Marxist ideas, actually. No, it was the photography led me to the scrolls, actually. And then the moment I saw the scrolls, I then started studying them and learned a great deal of... one thing you'll notice, I didn't point it out because there are lots of things I didn't point out in the film, but even when the camera, after all, is moving all the time, it's a movie of a movie, in a way, isn't it? And but even when it's not, your eye won't stay still. It moves around. And I discovered this was a Chinese principle called moving focus, of how you make the eye do this. And I somehow picked it up, and you can do it, and you can make different kinds of space, because it seems to acknowledge that, I think the way it works is as the eye takes time to move over the flat surface, you become aware of this in your head, and you can convert time to space, it being the same thing, really. And I found that I could use it in paintings, more recent paintings. I've used it. Lighter. I know maybe I shouldn't smoke in here, but seeing I'm the speaker, I assume the laws are a bit different here. And I know they frown on it in California, but like everything, there's two sides to smoking as well. It does you good, there's other things. It's true. There are two sides to everything.
David, a moment ago, we started to trace how making of one thing becomes the impetus for the next pursuit of ideas. And I was fascinated in your retrospective. It was actually the first time that I ever rented one of those tapes, walking the museum looking at it. Somebody had mentioned to me that you were the one speaking as opposed to the curator. And it was
is about. I mean, it's just a process that goes on of discovery, I hope. In a way, I mean, perhaps that's what fascinated me about the scroll. It's a journey, it's a narrative as well. And I've always been deeply interested in narrative. I didn't go along with the modernist notion that narrative was gone, or, I mean, there's always narrative. Or the idea that, therefore, Cubism led to abstraction. As I say, there was an abstraction before. It's a mad idea, that. I don't know. I'm always looking out for things, changing. It's always a journey, and I was always told it's the journey that counts, not the destination. We seem to know where we're going. We all end up the same way. So it must be the journey. Well, stereoscopic. The struggle to depict reality is an endless struggle. I mean, the idea that we have reached, that photography is the most vivid depiction of reality, it's true, it's a vivid depiction, but we must go further. There must be ways to go further. And the one way they found, in a sense, or thought they'd found, was stereoscopic photography, which, frankly, they figured out before the turn of the century. But there is a problem with it. You're not in the space. You're in a void. You're always looking into a box. You're deeply aware of that. Well, we don't see the world that way. We never think we're in a void. You're always in the space. In movies, they've done the same thing. I mean, in a way, their arithmetic, amazingly, was wrong when they're only dealing with 4 numbers. They tried to make what they called 3D movies. Well, that's not what they were doing at all. Any ordinary movie is 3-dimensional in the sense it's got 1 way, 2 ways, and linear time is 3 dimensions. They're trying to make a 4-dimensional movie, which is just like here. Well, frankly, if they succeeded, you wouldn't know where you were at all, or you'd think that was it. The whole thing is a movie. It's a kind of stupid idea, actually. There's other ways. They could go other. They've gone the wrong way, and they've gone the way because they thought perspective was true. It's always to keep it doing that, which means you're always outside of it. But there are other ways. They could use cameras. You could use a movie camera different ways. But nobody seems to, but I figured out how you could do it. But it makes it difficult, but it's possible. Sorry? Well, the only thing that interested me about holograms was the theoretical aspect, that a part contained the whole. But otherwise, the images, I think, are a bore, frankly. I've never found one exciting. I think they're a tiny novelty. I don't know. It's like the stereoscopic photograph. I mean, maybe you could do it. I don't quite know how they're made. I haven't played with it myself, but I've never found any that are really interesting. Not for me.
Have you seen the Holograms?
Sorry?
The film Holograms, Napoleon, back in the 20s. Did you see that? It'd be wonderful for you to see it. It has sequences of triptychs which are part narrative and part commentary on the narrative. It's really fun videotape.
Oh.
What you do right now.
In a way, I must tell you, I used to go and see movies all the time, but I don't now. I've got a bit bored with them, like I'm bored with television, and I think it's the way of seeing, frankly. That's what's boring. It's too monotonous. It's, to me, the best movie I've seen in the last 15, 20 years. The movie critics hated it. They were very dismissive, stupid. Was Fellini's The Ship Sails On, which was deeply about being a movie, about depiction, about the problems of depiction. They thought the movie was about the plot. It was pretty stupid of them, I thought. And in fact, I nearly wrote to the New York Times Vincent Canby's review of it. I thought he was ignorant, actually. He complained about their voices didn't synchronize, because the guys, Fellini doesn't care whether they speak Italian or they speak anything, just he puts it in afterwards. But I thought that's like complaining about the glue coming out of the side of a collage or something. You know, it was silly. And I think I've seen the movie 30 times, and there's not many movies you could see 30 times. You'd have seen it. And movies are not like music. They tend to reveal themselves very quickly. But I recommend, you can get it on video, and I recommend it. I really recommend it. It's a stunning, and it's very, very beautiful visually, but it's also amusing as well. It's clever, witty. It's got many layers. There's many layers to it. And I'm always finding other ones when I see it for the 31st time. Well, it's playing with, you mean the sequences are totally linear. Well, why would they worry about? I don't think they don't see time quite that way anyway, do they? Actually, I'll tell you this, when I get catalogues sent through the mail, and I got a catalogue, I've lost it for the moment, it's a pity, because I got a catalogue from an exhibition in Paris it was called Prix de Rome winners from 1795 to 1850. And most of the artists I'd never heard of, actually. And the few good pictures in the book, you noticed there were an artist you'd heard of. But this was a competition organized by the French government. All governments, of course, have an interest in depiction. They know what it means, and that's why, for instance, there's a great deal, a government has a lot to say about photography and very little to say about drawing and painting at the moment. They do. There's more rules about photography. I'll point out, for instance, if I photograph you, I have to have your signature before I could put it in a magazine. But if I draw you, I don't. Well, what's that inferring? It's inferring it's you there or something, that it's not really, and you have some right over that image. But it's a strange area, I think. But to go back to the catalogue, they were given a subject. They were mostly biblical subjects or mythological subjects. So there was a kind of narrative. And what I noticed was, by about 1850, if you notice in a Poussin, for instance, the narrative is told, in a sense, like the Chinese scroll, from left to right. There's 2 or 3 layers of figures, and you read it that way. And when people were trying to make more space going that way, what happened was I started laughing at some of the pictures, because they didn't make sense if you're making the space go that way, because one event must have happened in front of another, and you could see what the problems were happening. Well, normally we don't see these pictures today, But I then realized that, well, of course you can see why about 1855, 60, any sensitive artist knew there were serious problems with this way of depicting the world. And the moment they saw something else, those Japanese prints that were just wrapping up porcelain in Paris, they responded to another way of seeing the world. And we've, unfortunately, in art history, we've forgotten that. They tend to downplay that whole area. I pointed out even Robert Hughes in that television series. There's very little about Oriental art at the beginning. Very, very little. It's as though it came from nowhere, well, which it didn't. And it doesn't really give a reason as why there are always problems about depiction. It's never ending and so on. And that we'd forgotten that had happened. I think now we've got another problem. Photography is everywhere. Most of the images we see of the world are photographs. But it's a certain way of seeing that. It's always distanced, I think. And I think finally you get bored with it. You're bored with it. And what we want is something else. And I found that you could change photography actually if you drew. What I did was actually drawing in a way. That Pear Blossom Highway piece, the way I pieced it together, the way I did it, I felt I was drawing. And my photography friends actually said, well, it isn't a photograph, it's painting. But it was only made with a camera and just using the photographic process. But the fact that you could push it further by using something like drawing, I loved that idea. Because, again, I was at art schools in England when they abandoned drawing. They abandoned teaching it, which I thought was the weirdest thing of all. I opposed it. I said they were crazy. And, of course, it's having to come back. It won't. But they did it because I assumed, frankly, I always blamed a lot of it on Frank Stella when he said you could have painting without drawing. Well, you can, but only of a certain kind, and it's rather narrow. And frankly, you'd get bored of it after a while. And they used to criticize me in England. Once I went to some conference, and I said, well, it's drawing going. And they said, oh, it's back to the life room. I said, no, it's forward to the life room. You do it in a different way. There's wonderful ways. I pointed out it took Picasso about 40 years before he could, in the first Cubist paintings where he'd made a view of the front and back of a person and how crude they were in 1907. It wasn't until the 50s he'd made wonderful ones where it's smooth and you feel skin on things and they weren't just like diagrams. If it took him 40 years, lesser mortals will have to take longer time. But no, I'm losing my hearing. I'm going deaf. But if you speak up, I'll... Sorry. What am I painting now? Actually, I've just been doing some portraits in the last 2 weeks. I haven't done portraits for a long time. I got friends come and sit. And I painted them from life. That's what I've been doing. But I've been doing some big paintings of rooms, spaced in a different way. Again, mostly from making the eye move about and so on. And so they are very spacey. I'm just sending a big one to London to add to the retrospective that's going there, because they keep altering it. And so I thought I'd put it in. And I also, some of the portraits, actually, I bought a laser printer and found it's marvelous with the paintings, and it blows them up stunningly. Well, it's a very different kind of reproduction. In fact, I think what's fascinating is, I'm trying to point out when people say, well, why is it a bit different and so on, because I think it's done something again with space. I pointed out an ordinary reproduction uses a camera, and the painting is hung on a wall, and the camera is about 3, 4 feet, 5 feet from the painting. And we think the space between the camera and the painting isn't there, but it is there. But in the laser printer on xerography, that space has been removed. The camera is now actually, as it were, right up against the surface. And it does make a difference, makes a vast difference, I think. And I'd never realized that it was that visible. But once you do, you begin even to see it more. And I don't know, I'm just playing around with it now.
Okay, I think that should do it. Ending.
On behalf of all the students who have put this together and everybody else, thank you very much, Mr. Hockney, for coming down. We really consider it a gift. There's a kind of reception right over in this area, and we have alcoholic beverages and chips and things.